going. My paper is called As If Reaching Towards the Heavens, A Theology of Suicide. And I'm going to go... You guys ready? You ready to talk about suicide? All right, good. Even in the most dire personal circumstances, such as a terminal illness in which treatment would cause varying forms of suffering to a person and their loved ones, or the condition of a prisoner of war under threat of enemy torture, suicide is often considered to be a violation of our most sacred social mores. Even so, then is suicide, in the absence of such extenuating circumstances, considered to be an ultimate taboo. Accordingly, suicide is all too often a fact of life approached with the closed mind. Subjects of suicide are often lucid and considered to be rational in other aspects of their decision-making. Thus, it seems unlikely that suicide is always the result of insanity or irrationality. A person might have valid reasons for the decision to no longer live. The reasoning behind suicide, then, must be examined, and provision of compassionate theological and philosophical reasoning about these existential and ethical dilemmas ought to be a duty of any thoughtful believer. This essay's chief aims are to examine the problem of non-sacrificial and intentional self-death under the worldviews of atheistic existentialism and Christian theism, to then present arguments for and against this form of suicide in light of key tenets of these two opposing worldviews, and finally to offer a Christian theology that best ministers to the subject in existential despair. This endeavor will be made with the philosophies of Albert Camus and Gabriel Marcel in mind. Section 1. Camus' Absurdity, the State of Man, and Arguments Concerning Suicide. Jean-Paul Sartre is famous for his claim that man is condemned to be free. This notion of condemnation is a consistent theme throughout atheistic existentialism. One of its best illustrations was made by Camus. Comparing existence to the Greek myth of Sisyphus, Camus opens the myth of Sisyphus by writing, "The gods had condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly rolling a rock to the top of a mountain, whence the stone would fall back on its own weight. They had thought with some reason that there is no more dreadful punishment than futile and hopeless labor." Camus' analogy seems apt for describing existential absurdity. Man finds himself thrust into a reality in which he's seemingly free, yet so confined within his own limitations. Camus struggled to make sense of the temptation of escape through suicide, writing, "In its way, suicide settles the absurd. It engulfs the absurd in the same death. But I know that in order to keep alive, the absurd cannot be settled. It escapes suicide to the extent that it is simultaneously awareness and also rejection of death. It is at the extreme limit of the condemned man's last thought. The contrary of suicide, in fact, is the man condemned to death. That revolt gives life its value." Close quote. According to Camus, suicide does in fact resolve the problem of absurdity, but it does so in the wrong way. It is an acceptance of a form of life in which the individual has no true say in the matter of his own existence. Instead of surrender to death, one must fight it. Camus continues, "It may be thought that suicide follows revolt, but that would be thought wrongly. For it does not represent the logical outcome of revolt. It is just the contrary, by the consent that it presupposes. Suicide, like the leap, is acceptance at its extreme." Close quote. However, why think that revolt offers more value to life, or that suicide is the most extreme acceptance of the absurdity that's found within it? There seem to be several reasons why this is not the case. Camus simply assumes that the suicidal subject's choice and suffering is more qualitatively valuable than its termination. But it can just as easily be argued that the quality of an individual's suffering is precisely his defeat in life. Reasons why this is not the case should be expected from Camus, since he is proposing that the subject continuously multiply the quantity of his own suffering until natural death. Consider taking Camus' condemnation verbiage literally. Groups of prisoners, all wrongly convicted and awaiting execution, are housed within a death row ward. The halls of the prisons tremble with the anguished screams of the innocent. Their executioners, acting as fate, are in wait for each of them. The guards are proud of the misery of their captives and eager at the prospect of claiming yet another life. An individual prisoner sits in his cell and, as earlier described, is sentenced to certain death. Every waking moment multiplies this prisoner's suffering, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Yet, unbeknownst to his overseers, this prisoner has a blade, besides a will to revolt. Through the act of suicide, this prisoner can finally control for his own both the quantity and the quality of his suffering, alongside eliminating all satisfaction of those in opposition to him, all while remaining distinct and autonomous from every group that surrounds him. In this case, the subject's willful death is clearly a more rational response to his dreadful predicament, and is far more noble option than Camus' rebellion. Furthermore, Camus ends his Sisyphus essay with a quote as famous as the essay itself, when he writes, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." But Sisyphus wasn't happy. Camus is essentially asking that one pretend that reality is not the way that it is, and no system exists in which what is fundamentally illusory could be considered real. I'm sorry, guys, I'm not feeling very hot right now. Take a break for water. Can someone open that door, please? Okay, thank you. Section 2, Gabriel, Marcel, the state of man, and arguments concerning suicide. Thank you. Thus far, suicide has been described from the viewpoint of existential atheism. However, the worldviews discussed might appear to take the non-existence of God for granted, or as John Paul Sartre once wrote, "There is no human nature, since there is no God to conceive of it." This assumption of atheism is important. If God is seen as no more than a mere postulate of man, instead of a legitimate explanation of him, then the pains of existence may never be more meaningfully addressed and alleviated. This then leaves the Christian philosopher with an important question. Does the Christian God, as presented by our next philosopher, Gabriel Marcel, offer any genuine help to the problem of absurdity? As a Catholic philosopher, Gabriel Marcel affirmed that Christian dogma contained true statements about the nature of reality, and that man's reach towards purpose was not one which was made in vain. Marcel stressed that man's inability to rationally connect his own desires to a meaning with the world that seems so devoid of overall significance did not mean that the world is in fact devoid of this significance, but rather that the state of man is such that he is unlikely to find it on his own. For Marcel, it seems to be the case that man is searching not only for purpose for himself, but a purpose that transcends himself. Articulated another way, it appears as a hunger man does not have within himself an ability to gratify, towards an end that is unquestionably better for anyone to have than to not have. Humankind's universal search for hope was evidence that he was in a state of significant awareness, and possibly even a vague knowledge of God by the simple fact of his own moral and meaningful contingent experience. So, in other words, man cannot not know of God in some vital sense. However, Marcel did draw some important epistemological and phenomenological distinctions that must now be addressed. Marcel's existentialist approach to philosophy was multi-layered, and each level is crucial to helping the suicidal individual find rest in an absurd world. Marcel's first observation is that man finds himself with an ontological demand in a broken world. Marcel's explanation of the brokenness of the world is unclear. However, what is clear is that man's ontological demand is his terrible need for obtaining a state of rest. Man finds himself free and surrounded by others, yet is unable to involve himself into meaningful relationships with those who surround him. Marcel believed that it was all too common to see both ourselves and others in a technical sense, meaning that we see ourselves and our fellow humans' label or utility instead of an image bearer of God. According to Marcel, this arose from a misunderstanding of the proper function of humankind, because we were not meant to be seen but known, both by ourselves and by others. This destructive pattern of dysfunction led directly to despair and was broken by deep and ongoing forms of introspective experience, realizing one's need for proper reflection in his relationship to others. This search, which he repeatedly refers to as the ontological, was a process that he believed was the chief aim of the philosophical endeavor. For Marcel, proper philosophy was not an analytical examination of abstract ideas or concepts, which he called primary reflection, but rather a deep examination of oneself, which he called secondary reflection. Marcel believed that primary reflection could actually become detrimental to the true goals of philosophy because it at times impersonalized the search for meaning and negated one's own capacity to realize oneself. Successful secondary reflection was phenomenological in character and brought one from a state of despair into a state of hope by leading one into an understanding of the difference between problematic and mysterious modes of interpersonal connections. For example, if I were to remain in a primarily reflective state, then I would continue to see myself and others in the crude terms of our parts and the uses of those parts. I would only be adjusted with or separate from the other and would be in a kind of superficial possession of them, and I would approach them in a disingenuous manner. I might view us the way that I might view an inductive argument or an algebraic equation instead of a brilliant and unique pair of individuals that were meant to be experienced by one another. Marcel called this the problematic approach to reality. This would again limit the way that I view myself and others, thus limiting myself to only quasi-relationships, and despair would continue. However, if I proceeded to a secondarily reflective state, then I would discover myself and others as individuals meant to experience one another in a profound and surrendered relationship. We could then achieve the metaphysical correlation for which we exist. Marcel called this participation with another a mysterious mode of relation. It is at this point that we are able to realize the sacred nature of the other and come to relate to each other as a thou. While the mysterious mode is the ideal way in which you enter relationships with others, it is also the way in which despondent individuals are able to enter into their relationship of the highest importance, their relationship with God, who is the absolute thou. Although frequently dealing with suicide in his writings, Marcel never offers a direct argument against it. Instead, his thoughts on the problem of death seem to be rooted in his insistence that we are instead in a primary struggle with the problem of life. He writes, "Surrounded by these accumulated obscurities, which are somehow handed down from an unknown future to the depths of a past which is recognized less and less as something given, there is one certainty that is inescapable. I shall die. Only my death, among all the things which await me, is non-problematic." Close quote. When Marcel uses the term non-problematic, he is making a point that in a world without ultimate transcendence, one's own death is the only thing that you can actually confront with any confidence. It is the only genuine fact that will be placed before you. Minus participation, all man's interactions are likely to become problematically natured abstractions. Typical to existentialism, Marcel views man as a free being. However, the willful decision of non-participation in the lives of others is actually an eventual rejection of God, since God is the highest other. In an attempt to preserve our own well-being, we are actually acting in a negation of God, and ironically, of ourselves. Marcel writes, "Who am I? You alone really know me. You alone really judge me. To doubt you is not to free myself, but to annihilate myself. The fact that it is here, and here alone, that this problematic is overcome, and that in such a life, the imminent presence of death is abolished in the fullness of being itself." Close quote. As previously mentioned, Marcel's philosophy centers around seeing another as a thou. This required the idea of constancy or faithfulness, but constancy often lacked an idea of fidelity. This is important for ministerial effect in a Christian life, because while these words are typically thought of as synonymous, Marcel believed that they were distinct from one another. This is crucial in correcting a worldview of despair because we approach and define ourselves and others with simple constancy in mind. While not opposed to constancy, fidelity was different in two ways. First, it was an utterly humble expectation of your own nature and was not found in an individualistic view of yourself. Instead, it was an acknowledgement of yourself as a being that was meant for inner subjectivity. While constancy often reduces one to mere function and consequence, fidelity embraced the painful expectations upon reality, and it offered hope to oneself through its expression to another. Contrasted with most atheistic existentialisms, autonomy was useful only to the point that it was used as an investment in the lives of others. Second, fidelity was a constantly willed act. Continual renewal of this principle made it a creative fidelity. Marcel believed that this was key to understanding death and despair. He writes, "It is important to notice here how the problem of fidelity is linked to the problem of death. Is there really a problem? Insofar as I have created a void around me, it is quite clear that I can be lured to my death and make preparations as for some indefinite sleep. This situation is entirely different as soon as the thou manifests itself. Fidelity truly exists only when it defies those absences, triumphs over those absences which we've called death. Fidelity, however, leaves the suicidal in a sort of quandary. Marcel would surely say that an individual's outlook of despair, however virtuous that individual might otherwise be, would come from a constancy-based viewpoint of himself and others. This means that he might view life and relationships as those mere forms of motions and actions previously mentioned. Yet, in order to change his outlook on himself, an individual would seem to require a previous revelation of fidelity. Upon closer reflection, however, this is not the case. While elevated forms of reflection are a desired end, primary reflection is not in any sense useless. An individual may come to partake in what is secondary through primary understanding of his concepts. Said another way, man is able to intermittently enter secondary reflection through primary reflection, as long as he acts upon what he finds in primary reflection. It is in a sense that Marcel's practice of primary to secondary reflection resembles Aristotelian virtue theory, in that one may become more of a creative participant in the lives of others through simple thoughtful habit. It is at this point that Marcel's idea of creative fidelity becomes most helpful to the despairing subject. Where the common rationale of the suicidal was a focus upon the well-being, or the lack thereof, for themselves, Marcel encouraged an outpouring of oneself to another and an expectation of disappointment, even if a subject did not fully understand that act. If an individual finds him or herself in despair, they are to empty themselves of prideful dispositions towards that despair through hopeful relationships with others. When one felt that they had no more to give, they ought to examine the quality of what they were offering to another and offer a humble rendition instead. Marcel's creative fidelity was also an obedience to God and a path to discovering his own true nature. He writes, "If I stay on the hither side of the ontological affirmation, I can usually call into question the reality of the bond linking me to some particular being. In this domain, disappointment is always possible in principle. But on the other hand, the more my consciousness is centered on God himself, the less conceivable this disappointment will be. But in the act in which I commit myself, I at the same time have extended an infinite credit to him to whom I did so. Hope means nothing more than this." Now, counter-arguments offered toward creative fidelity can be difficult because objections made against it are often problematic in nature. And when I use the term problematic, I'm using the abstract way in which we view others. But in relation to suicide, Marcel's philosophy seems to place one in an odd, even paradoxical position. An immediate phenomenological experience is required for secondary reflection and transcendence, yet one may come to recognize the products of secondary reflection as valuable through primary reflection. But according to most Christian doctrines, God is the primary value, or the primary giver of values known through primary experiences. So it seems to be the case that those who are not already in a mysterious relationship with God are already committing a form of suicide. If indeed suicide is an annihilation of the self. And if death is the only non-problematic thing that man faces, then why ought suicide not become a viable solution to man's problem of life? Man's desperation for purpose may be the essential product of his own awareness to the divine, however problematic or misguided. Yet, if this is allowed into consideration, it may very well be the case that the most desperate of men, especially the suicidal infidel, are those who are in the most earnest and honest search for God. This becomes the center of theological problems concerning suicide. Section 3. The hiddenness of God, Christian doctrine, and arguments concerning suicide. The God proposition is confronted with both obvious and nuanced objections. Its obvious struggle is best expressed in a question that's asked by laity and philosopher alike. If God, as described by this Christian dogma, exists, then why is he so hidden? This is a rational objection. However, one must not accept it as a non-starter for dialogue on any matter. As previously stated, the very question of God's existence and purposes are ones that already involve a vague concept of the divine. So one's ability to pose upon himself the question of God might suggest that God is not as hidden as we might naturally assume. However, if man is of God, or the subject of which is the product of God, then why does this problem of absurdity even confront us at all? It should seem that these natures ought function harmoniously, if in fact they are so similar and brimming with its objective purpose. It is now appropriate to reframe suicide within a Christian context and defend suicide as a less rational response to absurdity, given Christian theism than atheism, while also offering ministerial advice to those in despair. But before we do that, we must understand Christian doctrine and the way that it comes off to the despairing, that it appears to the despairing. Christianity's guarantee of suffering must influence one's theological polemic against willful self-death. Traditionally, Christian themes such as original sin or the general or total depravity of mankind permeate much of Christian thought to the point that a legalistic opinion of the nature of man seems inevitable. If these doctrines are true, then it may be argued that suicide is a final straw in sin, a single act that can be taken to eliminate all other future sin, while advertently eliminating suffering. It can also be argued that suicide is but one way in which to eliminate future sin and suffering, while also immediately entering into relationship with the thou, with our God. Section 4. A theology of suffering. Appreciations for these objections and positions are understandable, but it might be a more effective step into a theology that grants such doctrines, but does not rely upon them. Due to an idea that the traditional mode of Christian doctrinal operations might actually create an ironic block before the transcendent itself. Instead, we ought to entertain a theology of suffering. According to Christian dogma, humans are separated from God and suffer greatly due to this separation. Under the rule of sin, man has become a contradiction, unable to reconcile his own anguish to a peaceful and higher ideal. Although man's suffering is great, God took it upon himself to enter into man's dismal condition and suffer alongside him. Man commonly seeks shelter from this concept, but great hope is actually to be found within it. A theology of suffering embraces the absurdity of life, our nature, and God by embracing grief itself. Because it seems that only through suffering might we be able to recognize and appreciate hope and enter into the communion or into our communion with our Creator. A theology of suffering seeks to imitate the torturous life of Christ, not to avoid it. When one thinks of relief in a Christian sense, they usually conjure up images of resurrections and renewed spirits and positive outlooks on the mysteries of God. However, this is a pretty sharp reversal from Christ-centered positions. Resurrections are achieved only through deaths, renewed spirits through anguish, and the imperatives of God to man are really not as mysterious once one takes an honest look at the examples made by Christ. A theology of suffering practices a hopeful and creative fidelity with the other in a pure Marcelian sense, while placing the weighty burden of existence described by Camus squarely upon us as a weight which we should hold for one another. I have a footnote here. My agnostic professor, Dr. Williford, recently asked me, why don't you Christians just help Sisyphus push the rock together? I believe his rhetorical question made a very valid and sharp point. So back to my essay. A theology of suffering also asserts that man's freedom is one that renders him responsible for his own actions, while accepting the idea that we will never be wholly rid of our individual torment by means of our own autonomy. It affirms the greater qualitative and quantitative amounts of suffering and says that they are to be praised, insofar as that they are suffered for the sake of another. We are free to end our lives or to continue it in self-negation. And it's in this sense that theology of suffering is also a theology of suicide. Nevertheless, a theology of suffering must insist that one not sell themselves so short by just one single act of physical suicide. In its place, we should view life as a privilege of ongoing dying, aimed towards a purpose higher than one's own mortality. An absurd trust in God is indeed required for full appreciation of such an enduring act, but it's an absurd trust that man seems designed to take. It is man's responsibility to step towards the great ocean of life and admit that he will never fully understand it. It is in this sense that a theology of suffering is also beneficial to both agnostic and believer, as long as we are freely acting in accordance with God's nature in a way that we do understand, that it is better to act upon the sole interest of another rather than themselves. It is in this radical duty that we might match the absurdity of life, while paving a path towards discovery of ourselves, the other, and God. I have a footnote here. Research upon this topic over time constantly reminded me of Soren Kierkegaard's famous quote from Provocations: "The Bible is very easy to understand, but we Christians are a bunch of swindlers. We pretend to be unable to understand it because we know very well the minute we do understand it, we're obliged to act accordingly." It is from this standpoint in which I use the term matches the absurdity of life. A theology of suffering is so counterintuitive that it might actually work if we ever attempt it. It is by an unreserved reach towards the other that we are in fact reaching towards God himself. Or as Marcel wrote, "A philosophy of transcendence must never divorce itself, even in principle, from a type of reflection, culminating not in a theory, but rather an understanding of what it is to be a saint." The fact is that here, and here alone, that the problematic is ultimately overcome, and that in such a life, the imminent presence of death is abolished in the fullness of being and presence itself. The fact that this saintliness, realized in some individuals, in some witnesses spread out over these centuries, is not felt to be an unnatural and outrageous anomaly by some weak humanity. It evokes echoes in our hearts, that it is to be the indecisive mind for a permanent stimulus. Just as we perceive in the inspired and creative individual on one level, the mediator of him, our God, who has no advance in technique, in knowledge, or in what is called morality, will ever bring near the individual who genuinely appeals to him from the depths of his own suffering. Close quote. This appeal is a Christian requirement and not an option. Thank you. I think we have a little bit. We have like 3 minutes for questions. Does anyone? I used some footnotes that I just don't think I could avoid, and that might have taken the 30 seconds. So does anyone have any questions or anything? We can do like a couple. I guess we can squeeze off a couple. Yeah.
So just for clarification, what I'm understanding you're saying is, from a Christian perspective, suicide, it's almost a daily suicide is what I'm understanding?
Yeah, it's surrender of oneself. So I have, I thought that you guys would be able to have the paper in front of you. Yeah, I have so many. All those had scriptures next to them.
Oh, okay.
So 1 Corinthians 15, Paul writes, "I protest, brothers, by my pride in you, which I have in Jesus Christ, I die every day."
Right.
Yeah. So it's a qualitative amount, not a quantitative amount. So linked to the idea that suicide is the unbeliever's most earnest and honest search for God. That was Marcel's view. It seems like if we're going to step into a place where we have a ministry role to that individual, then we'd be ready to wake up every day with people that surround us and saying, I in a way am dying today in order to put this person first. And in doing that, you so reach God, who is the thou, the absolute thou, for Marcel.
So you said Oh, sorry, I didn't say.
I don't think
You said Marcel, like his ontological
demand
demand
for the brokenness, for
is
broken world.
what helped him to understand, like, or how suicide is not okay. Like,
He's not arguing for suicide.
yeah.
The reason that I set up forth, it sounds like I want you to kill yourself on a couple of pages, but I don't want you to kill yourself. Please don't do that. But that ontological demand is something that Camus called the absurdity. This
Like a need to recognize the ultimate being.
do you ever wake up in the morning and just feel like, what is this? One more time, we're doing this again, one more time, one more day, what is this? That's the ontological demand within your soul and spirit.
So you're not talking about like an ontological argument as an understanding like God.
No.
Like an understanding of your being.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a way of recognizing, as an existentialist, he starts with the position that I first exist, and kind of a Kierkegaardian. Actually, was described himself as a neo-Socratic in the same way that Kierkegaard would. That truth is subjectivity in the sense that it is I that relates to others. And so if we don't get into that state, how can we understand others? Right? We're just emptying ourselves of nothing that's meaningful to the experience that correlates to why is there something rather than nothing? Why am I here? The absurdity of life, really. That understanding that as yourself, as a broken person in a broken world, is important in moving in relationships with others and therefore with God. Did that answer your question? Yeah, but it's not like an ontological argument or anything like that. Wherever we're, I do have a good quote in here from Camus in my footnotes. No one dies for the ontological argument. I have that in here because I had a whole section on apologetics, but I took it out because it was too long.
Mason, that was a really awesome, intriguing presentation. I wish we had more time for questions, but there's another presentation in here in like 3 minutes.
Oh, there's the other.
Yes.
The others coming in.
We should get some concern for them, you know.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys.
Relates to ourselves. So.
Yeah. I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm presenting on omniscience and